I've titled the talk Fund to End Homelessness because we need to have that objective in our minds around funding. This is a discussion largely around financing because today we're releasing the AHURI final inquiry report on the financing of homelessness services. So go to the AHURI website and download that at some appropriate time, not necessarily now, but have a look at that which is being released today. Just give you a little bit of that history. Essentially, you can divide the world pre-73 or pre-74, post-74. Pre-73, it was largely a matter of individual agencies and people organising their own response to homelessness. So the first women's refuge that you can see up there was a response of women. The Matthew Talbot Hospital, and we've seen the significant role of social agencies and churches in doing the work of responding to homelessness. But in 74, we do see government coming in the Whitlam period, and that expands out in 85 with the SAP program and NAHA and NPAR, and obviously the very large focus on homelessness with RUD and the large increase in funding that came with RUD and innovations in the homelessness system. So the last of those, and it's not deliberately colour versus black and white, it's just that that's what you just get on the web if you check out images. You've got black and white pictures from pre-74 and that's a foyer photo on the right. Those innovations, which the foyer in Western Australia involved a huge amount of funding from governments, from corporates and the like, and those changes that occurred were a really significant impetus in the system, and that was seen in a very large increase in real funding, which has now tended to dry up a bit, but we did see a very significant increase in funding associated with that period. The dollars that we have here on the financing of the homelessness system are largely, or entirely actually, dollars related to government funding. So we know a lot about government funding. We know virtually nothing, or we know very little. I was trying to get the grammar right. We know very little about the funding of non-government services. So we've got $763.6 million down to that precise dollar amount in terms of the specialist homelessness service system. Interestingly, it doesn't actually make up much of total funding, and when you look at the per day spend, you know, the dollars spent per day of support is actually incredibly low, and a very, very small proportion of total government recurrent funding. I tried to do my own example of that spaghetti diagram, and this is my best approach to that. It's a bit distorted in a way because you see on the left-hand side specialist homelessness services and the NAHA and NPAR funding going into specialist homelessness services, which are defined actually in terms of the fact that they get that kind of funding, as it turns out, because there's a number of services that don't get that funding which are entirely focused on homelessness, where we put them in the other homelessness service system. Now, the system as a whole, though, we've got different sources of funding. We've got self-source funding, philanthropic funding, impact investing and the like, and we have services that are getting funding from health and other related areas. So the system as a whole is quite large. The part that we know a lot about is the specialist homelessness service system. Part that we don't know about is pretty well the rest. And we need to know a little bit more about that. It is the dominant source of funding, no doubt, but we do need to think about those other sources of funding. And one of the points that Tony was making was to what extent are services required? He put it in he did put it in an ethical context to go out and get other sources of funding. That was one of the questions that we did address in our inquiry. So it turns out that services are in fact seeking to get sources of funding outside of government. It's not 100% at all, but it's far larger than the success rate. So there's a very, very large gap between the attempts to get funding by homelessness services outside of government and the actual outcome. So I'll return to that through the talk. Now, just one simple fact that came out of our inquiry when we're looking at the different sources of funding of services. So we went to all the services that we could find in Australia and asked them to fill in a survey, and we did get a reasonable response. And we divided those services up into specialist homelessness services and others. And for specialist homelessness services, we asked for all sources of funding, and the number that came out of that was that 85% of their funding was from government. And for specialist homelessness services, that was largely contributed by NAHA and NPAR funding and other government sources. For the non-specialist homelessness services, which are defined as those who are not getting NAHA and NPAR funding, the number drops a lot, obviously, to 60.6, but still government is dominant. And if you have a look at the ACNC data on sources of funding for charities in Australia, 85% is right at the top of the ladder in terms of government engagement in funding. But there is, of course, some good reason for that, because those experiencing homelessness are the poorest, the least able to finance their own service support. And so in other areas of government or in terms of social service delivery, there is a higher level of own revenue. But one of the things that comes out of this, of course, is that if it is the case that specialist homelessness services are in fact receiving the vast bulk of their money, then they are at risk. And Tony puts up the question, are they independent enough because of that? And so from a pure risk point of view, what we see is services being vulnerable. They end, and we had that as well. We had a list of services, and not all of those could be found because a number had in fact ended their delivery in the time period that we got the list because their funding from government had ended. So it's a risk position. And more than that, I think it is a position around trying to be effective in terms of outcomes. Now, Nicola did talk about the overall effectiveness of the system, and we do have data constraints in our ability to understand the overall effectiveness of the system. On the positive side, elements of our data are very good, the AIHW data, and that is the result of the homelessness services doing their work, is incredibly good administrative data. But what needs to happen is that administrative data as a whole needs to be matched up to understand better the outcomes that we're seeing. One thing that we have got, and it came out in Tony's data as well, is that the vast majority, 70% or even more, are in and out relatively quickly. That's a little like unemployment. And if we do say one thing about the effectiveness of the system, it is that we have not seen significant rises and rises and rises in homelessness, and we're not seeing that because we've seen exit for a majority of people. And for a very important, significant role of homelessness services, we have seen homelessness services actually, interestingly, against some common kind of perceptions, not keep people in the system, or else we would have seen large rises in homelessness. And there has been some good exit numbers out of homelessness into accommodation. I'd also say that the evidence has been relatively good on programs and large-scale evidence. So some of the work that we did, this is a AHURI piece that we published last year, or perhaps the year before. I'm losing track of years now. But what we looked at in Western Australia was we matched up all of those who were going through NPAR programs where they were entering into public housing from different points in terms of homelessness. So we matched those who were exiting different points into housing, public housing. We knew which housing program, which homelessness program they came from into public housing. And we asked two questions, how long did they stay there? And what was the impact in terms of the broader government system? In this case, we had linked health data. And what we saw was a very significant tenancy sustainability rate, other than for the corrective services area, where we do need much more work. But in other areas, high rates of tenancy sustainability in public housing with support, and very significant reductions in health costs. And they were the highest, obviously, for the highest needs, where those people were retained. So one thing we have to be very careful of is this notion that if we have to spend a lot for particular people with very high needs, that's going to be a very costly thing. Well, it turns out that that's not necessarily true. And indeed, when you look at the homelessness group, as we've said, it's heterogeneous, and around about a quarter of that group have very, very low health cost needs. Very low. You're not going to save any money out of them at all. But the point is, we may be doing something positive in terms of their lives. Now, the funding issues that came out of that study, obviously we talked about unmet need, and that came through in terms of how services reported the impact in our study. So they were at levels of financing that couldn't meet the needs that they were needing to meet. And that really was about housing, but it was about other things as well. It was about employment. We definitely are not seeing enough innovation around employment. And that was one area where services said, yes, we know we're not achieving enough in terms of employment of those who are coming through. And in some cases, an ethical question. I certainly in some contexts have had it almost suggested to me that my job is not to find employment for people. Well, I'm not sure about that one bit. But there are a lot of impacts in terms of that funding constraint. I've spoken about diversification. Diversification is a really significant issue. I've had the point made to me, look, it is the responsibility of government, and I agree it is the responsibility of government to do the heavy lifting on funding. But the other side of this is that we do need to see more diversified services in terms of revenue. But the services are trying, they're not necessarily being effective. So we need diversification. The other thing that came out was the significant issue around Indigenous homelessness. When you look at it, there's actually very little in terms of targeted programs around Indigenous homelessness, but with 20%, that's a huge number. And it's a massive problem. So we do need to look at that. And to end up, there's a range of other issues around funding, flexibility, and innovation. I actually think the level of philanthropic support is relatively low compared with other sectors. We've got really good examples of great philanthropic support, but overall it's relatively low, and we need to do something more about that. Impact investing is definitely on the table now. We're seeing some interesting stuff there. There's, though, beyond the bonds, there's an absolutely significant role that impact investing can play in affordable housing for targeted groups. There is a need to develop the capability of services in terms of raising revenue options. You know, when I go to a very small number of services, but some services, the capability is incredible. And the outcomes in terms of raising revenue are very significant. So it suggests to me that there's room for, if you like, spreading out of that kind of capability of raising revenue. We do want to see a greater focus, not complete, but outcomes-related funding. That is not. It doesn't have to be social impact bond kind of stuff. More outcomes-related funding, I think, is important. And the simple fact is we know, as a rule of thumb, if we have the 80-20 rule, every study I've ever done is coming up with this really interesting fact around the 50-50 rule. If I'm speaking to adult homeless who have some reasonable significant engagement in the homelessness system, 50% were homeless prior to the age of 18. And I know in significant number of cases, they had their first independent experiences of homeless 12, 13, 14. So we actually know that these things are happening early on, and we need to really do something around that. It's not just about kids in care, it's about kids who become significantly separated out and are independently homeless 12, 13, 14, or even earlier. And we need greater cross-sectoral responses and a definitely improved outcomes measurement system. So I'll just finish at that point, and thank you very much.